When historians describe Cleveland in 1903, they usually focus on what rose into view: the group plan taking shape downtown, the industrial boom along the Cuyahoga River, and the transformation of a modest lakefront town into one of America's great manufacturing centers. But the real story, largely absent from newspapers and still hidden in archival margins, unfolded underground. It commenced with a straightforward civic initiative. Engineers received orders to prepare terrain across the downtown district for public buildings, street expansion, and new utility infrastructure. While the city readied itself to become the sixth largest in America, the objective was utilitarian: clear the ground, excavate foundations, and assess whether the land could bear the burden of Cleveland's rapid modernization. But the instant workers started penetrating the soil, something unforeseen occurred. They pierced through strata that had remained concealed for decades. Below the lakefront district, at depths exceeding what municipal surveys had predicted, the teams discovered walls and chambers that matched no recognized construction. Their positioning was peculiar, their depth was remarkable, and the masonry bore no resemblance to anything in documented Cleveland history. It didn't even echo early American building methods as typically understood. This never appeared in official statements. It failed to reach the newspapers documenting the group plan. Yet in that year's internal documentation, a specific phrase emerges repeatedly: pre-existing structures, unforeseen depth, more elaborate than projected. The authorized account would eventually reduce all of this to remnants from earlier settlements, abandoned commercial basements, or merely misclassified geological features. Nothing remarkable, nothing deserving attention. But the survey images from that period, the ones processed in shadowy municipal offices while Cleveland celebrated its ascent, reveal something else. They reveal workers positioned next to limestone blocks carved with accuracy far sharper than any recognized tool of that era could produce. Blocks assembled so seamlessly that even through the grainy quality of early 1900s photography, no mortar joints are detectable. Architectural details etched into surfaces that bear no similarity to any documented Cleveland construction, but something more refined, more classical, more intentional. And the further they excavated, the more the strata ceased resembling history as we understand it, and increasingly resembled architecture that had been constructed over, concealed, and purposefully erased. Initially, the survey crews attempted to classify everything in the most straightforward manner: abandoned warehouse foundations, forgotten commercial cellars, natural limestone formations along the lakeshore. But as documentation grew and additional chambers were revealed, the contradictions expanded. Why were certain underground structures engineered to bear loads far exceeding anything situated above them? Why were particular stones formed in near uniform shapes as though produced rather than manually hewn? Why did certain passages continue into obscurity well beyond the boundaries of any recorded building? And the matter that disturbed even the most conventional engineers: why were these lower structures so ornate? The civic expansion demanded accurate surveys, yet the foundational architecture below sections of downtown Cleveland seemed constructed for something vastly grander than industrial warehouses and commercial blocks. Survey crews privately acknowledged amongst themselves that the scale and sophistication didn't correspond with any early settlement documentation, and while none of them employed terminology like vanished civilizations, they were recognizing something equally disturbing. Someone had constructed on this terrain previously. Not settlements, not simple structures. Grand buildings. As the records multiplied, so did the quiet. Reports grew briefer. Accounts became ambiguous. Images ceased displaying the broadest perspectives of the chambers. And then the excavation sites were partially closed again in late 1903, backfilled where necessary for the new construction, and much of what had been revealed was returned to obscurity. Only pieces survive: documentation, several photographs, and the subdued accounts of city planners who examined the files before some vanished. But even from what endures, a configuration becomes apparent. Architecture too substantial for any documented early Cleveland settlement, masonry too exact for the accepted chronology, construction techniques that appear inherited, foundations that seem to originate from an entirely different building epoch. When the excavation crews advanced past the initial identifiable strata beneath downtown, the assumptions were straightforward. They anticipated discovering natural bedrock along the lakeshore, possibly some abandoned canal work and dispersed traces from early settler construction. Nothing peculiar, nothing exceptional. But within weeks that premise disintegrated because rather than a clear progression of geological stages, the crews unearthed a succession of architectural strata that didn't function the way layers of an ordinary city are meant to function. The initial anomaly was orientation. Each stratum, early settlement, pre-industrial and whatever existed beneath, appeared to maintain the same directional bearing, the same angles, the same geometric framework. Different periods shouldn't exhibit that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades. They don't construct in flawless alignment with people who existed generations apart. Yet below Cleveland's downtown, they did. Chambers from one period positioned precisely above chambers from another. Corridors aligned with passages interred meters beneath them. Foundation walls maintained the same course even when divided by indeterminate years. It was as though every population that ever constructed on this ground was replicating an original design, one that no longer appears in any municipal documentation. As the labourers dug further, the strata grew more peculiar. Below the anticipated clay and glacial drift, they started finding stonework that resembled nothing like typical frontier construction. Substantially larger blocks, considerably tighter connections, configurations that appeared too geometrically precise for anything in Cleveland's recorded chronology. Certain chambers looked nearly excessive, vaulted spaces with perfect curvature, executed with an accuracy that didn't correspond to the primitive implements of any documented early American settlement. And then arrived the finding that confused even the most traditional members of the engineering team. Water-eroded foundations, limestone surfaces, polished as though sculpted by flowing water, lower passages with erosion indicators, floors with a patina that only develops after extended saturation. Yet there exists no historical documentation of these areas ever being flooded beyond the normal lake fluctuations. No charts indicating ancient watercourses below these particular locations. Nothing that accounts for why substantial portions of the deepest foundations appear as though they had previously been submerged or interred beneath strata of saturated sediment for extended periods. Survey images captured in 1903 demonstrate this unmistakably. Labourers positioned beside blocks so immense that the men appeared diminutive by comparison. Stones carved so accurately that even contemporary stonemasons examine the archival photographs in amazement. Angles and connections that mirror classical architecture far more sophisticated than anything early Cleveland is attributed with. But the most troubling detail was not what surfaced in the photographs. It was what failed to surface in the archives. The authorized reports composed in the years following the excavation scarcely reference these characteristics. Certain illustrations exclude the deepest chambers altogether. Particular layers of stonework are condensed with indefinite terminology like earlier construction or previous foundations, even though the photographs demonstrate they were far more intricate than that. The quiet is difficult to overlook, because if these lower strata genuinely belong to recognized historical eras, why weren't they portrayed in detail? Why weren't the exceptional construction methods recorded thoroughly? Why were the photographs dispersed across city repositories instead of compiled into a single municipal document? Even certain limestone blocks presented a concern. Edges too precise, surfaces too refined, decorative mouldings too consistent, marks that appeared less like frontier masonry and more like classical architecture. Architecture that, based on the conventional chronology, didn't exist when Cleveland was supposedly founded. What the excavation crews revealed were structures that didn't correspond to early American construction, didn't correspond to Native American workmanship, and didn't even correspond to one another. Instead, they constituted a peculiar architectural vocabulary, one that appeared to originate from multiple periods yet somehow remained cohesive, oriented, and impossibly refined. The initial surprise arrived with the rooms themselves. These weren't primitive root cellars or confined storage spaces. They were geometrically flawless spaces, chambers shaped with precise proportions, arches that preserved their curve impeccably across decades, and stone vaults arranged with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master design that no longer exists in any repository. Certain chambers were sealed entirely, packed with material so compact that labourers assumed they had reached natural bedrock. But once breached, they disclosed interiors that appeared undisturbed since the moment they were closed. Refined walls, assembled stone, and architectural configurations that generated more mysteries than solutions. And then arrived the characteristic that still confounds researchers presently: the ornate columns and capitals. Formerly, they were subsequently identified as debris from demolished buildings or misidentified support posts. But nothing about them corresponds to characteristic frontier construction or rudimentary support structures. These displayed classical proportions, decorative capitals with floral motifs, and bases carved with accuracy that suggested professional stonecutters. Certain columns were substantial enough to support multi-story buildings. Others featured fluting and details that matched Greco-Roman architecture, almost like fragments of a civic complex that predated anything Cleveland officially possessed. Labourers from 1903 characterised them in personal correspondence as imported architecture. Not local work, but refined columns with classical training, though nobody could specify where such trained craftsmen would have originated in frontier Cleveland. Another peculiarity emerged in the positioning of certain streets and structures. These were not merely resting on natural ground level. Many early photographs of Cleveland show building entrances positioned well above modern street level, with entire first floors buried beneath accumulated fill. It generated an unsettling possibility. The downtown district may not merely rest on natural lakefront terrain. It may rest on something substantially larger, a previous city whose dimensions were never documented, never taught, and never clarified in the authorized history of Cleveland. The further the labourers excavated, the more peculiar the discoveries became. Limestone blocks emerged with decorative friezes. Certain surfaces displayed carved rosettes, refined cornices, almost museum-quality stonework. Others displayed precision-carved mouldings so elaborate that contemporary architects still debate about what culture could have created them. But the finding that produced the most bewilderment was the architectural coherence discovered in foundation layers. Certain fragments appeared to match, pieces from different excavation sites displaying identical design elements, identical proportions, organized like they once belonged to a unified architectural plan that stretched across the entire district. The authorized explanation provided subsequently: salvaged materials from demolished buildings, reused architectural elements. But that does not account for why these refined pieces emerge in the lowest strata, not in later construction, but positioned as original foundations, integral components of the deepest architecture. Shortly following these findings, something peculiar started occurring. Chambers were resealed, passages were backfilled, deep portions of the locations were isolated from continued excavation. Certain of this was formally designated as structural safety matters necessary to avoid compromising the new construction projects. But the choices about which chambers to reseal initially and which sections to interpermanently generated subdued questions among witnesses, because the spaces that were closed promptly were invariably the ones that contested the authorized chronology the most. The ornate columns, the classical details, the coherent architectural fragments, the refined passages that appeared to extend far beyond the excavation area. These passages were possibly the most enigmatic discovery of all. They weren't haphazard tunnels, they were components of a systematic configuration, a network of corridors that appeared less like utility spaces and more like a subterranean extension of something grand. Oriented, calculated, organized, as though they once connected to a substantially larger underground infrastructure, one that existed below the lakefront long before the Cleveland we recognize ever appeared on maps. And yet, almost as quickly as they were revealed, many were resealed. Their openings obstructed, their purpose unexplored, their presence quietly eliminated from later civic surveys. When you examine the concluding weeks of the 1903 excavations, something becomes impossible to disregard. The initiatives didn't conclude, they were halted. Not finalized, not terminated, halted. The further the survey crews proceeded, the more the character of their documentation transformed. Initial entries were assured almost procedural, but by the conclusion, the language becomes guarded, indefinite, and oddly incomplete, as though someone else abruptly controlled what could be recorded. And this is where the ultimate mystery commences, because the final chambers they accessed beneath downtown Cleveland weren't typical, they weren't geological, they weren't frontier remnants, they weren't even classifiable, they were something else altogether. Multiple accounts, the few that persisted, portrayed architecture that abruptly transformed from the recognizable to the inexplicable. Walls with stonework so tight you couldn't insert a blade between them. Vaulted ceilings formed with accuracy that early American construction was never meant to possess. Platforms engineered for structures far grander than anything recorded above them, and passages that stretched beyond the excavation area, vanishing into darkness below the modern city. But here's the aspect that always gets concealed. The most refined chambers were the ones that were reinterred first. Labourers described refilling complete rooms, closing entrances, packing soil into spaces that had just been revealed. It wasn't gradual, it was prompt. The authorised explanation, geological volatility, construction schedules, municipal budgets. But if it was solely about practicality, why were the most ancient, pristine, most architecturally sophisticated chambers the ones resealed first? And why were the obviously unstable areas left accessible for recording? It doesn't make logic unless those lower strata posed a different variety of danger, not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the foundations below Cleveland's downtown genuinely displayed construction methods beyond frontier capacity, and if certain of those chambers didn't correspond to any documented settlement at all, then the complete accepted narrative of Cleveland's founding starts to crumble. Imagine what it would signify if a modern city were constructed on top of something far more ancient, something grand, something refined, something we didn't construct. Imagine what it signifies if the mudflood stories weren't folklore but actual evidence of previous inhabitants concealing or burying what preceded. And perhaps that is why the 1903 findings were quietly reinterred, not to safeguard the locations but to safeguard the narrative. The remaining photographs convey their own narrative. Labourers positioned next to architecture that appears almost classical, columns that mirror ancient designs, decorative systems too sophisticated for their presumed age. These aren't the varieties of findings historians prefer to clarify. They're the varieties they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest architecture, the most refined strata sealed away again? Because when you step back, the configuration becomes apparent. The classical stonework was interred, the ornate columns were interred, the inexplicable passages were interred, the grand foundations were interred, the coherent architectural fragments were interred, and even portions of the photographic documentation vanished, almost as though the excavation had inadvertently disclosed a chapter of history that wasn't meant to emerge. A chapter more ancient than Cleveland's official founding, more ancient than the frontier narrative we examine, more ancient than the story we were provided. and for one brief instant in 1903, the earth opened sufficiently to reveal it. But rather than examining it, they closed it again, sealed it, backfilled it, rewrote it, or feigned to. Because if Cleveland stands on top of architecture erected by a culture we no longer recognise, then the genuine question is not what was revealed in 1903. It's what else remains beneath the cities of America. What other downtowns, what other structures, what other refined layers were quietly reinterred before anyone thought to photograph them? The 1903 excavation wasn't merely a civic expansion initiative. It was a glimpse, a brief inadvertent glimpse into a version of history we were never intended to witness.